Hi, my name is Howard Greenland and I am a self-employed carpenter and joiner. I restore, draft proof and overhaul and upgrade sash windows, and I work throughout Norfolk and Suffolk. What I'm going to do is basically an in-depth look at how to draft proof and overhaul a sash window. I've got one here on the bench. I've got all of the tools, everything I need to basically do the job, and the plan is to show you how to do it, so that if you were to buy, say, a draft proofing kit, you could use this as an instruction. So I have got absolutely everything here. What I'll be doing is keep switching on and off to try and save some time. There'll be times when the camera is on the tripod as now, looking at the window behind me. There'll be times when I pick it up and show you exactly what's going on close up. But to start with, this is a 1930s sash window that was removed from somewhere, and I bought it off of Gumtree for £20. It's perfect really, because it's got plenty of size so that we can see what's going on. It's in reasonable condition. I'm not going to mess around and spend hours sanding it and cleaning it up and painting it, because actually this is about showing a layman who wants to have a go himself how to do the technical stuff, the draft proofing, the cutting, the measuring, what tools you do need, what tools you don't need, and learn a little bit about sash windows at the same time. So what I'm going to switch you off, and then I'm going to put you off the tripod, and I will start showing you tools and stuff. Okay, this is the minimum that I would turn up at somebody's house with. I have got wipes and wax and sash cord and a set of weighing scales, a load of lead weights, a nail gun, various sanding machines. I've got a chop saw for cutting miters. You don't actually have to have one of those, but you would want a miter box and a handsaw, a router, and the router needs to have a cutter in it that's appropriate for fitting the brushes into the sashes. Transformer in this case, because all my tools are 110 volts, a planer for planing the sides or the bottoms or the tops of the sashes, a drill, not a huge number of hand tools to be fair, pliers, cutters, a couple of scrapers, some chisels, a small hand saw, Stanley knife, a brush, some pin tacks, some screws. The tacks that I use are a 40mm tack for holding in the parting beads, and a 20mm tack for holding the brushes in, and a staple gun, which I use for holding the brushes into the staff beads, because that fires a 10mm staple, which is basically as small as it gets, and that's all you need to stop the brush from moving around. So this is the basics. Then on top of that, ladders and a good hoover. A good hoover is a must. I've had a Henry for years. It doesn't have to be a Henry, of course, you use whatever you've got. But my Henry I can connect up to my machines, and they're very good at, well, they do the job. Now, this window is typical 1930s. It's been ripped out of a house somewhere, ended up in a builder's yard. It's tired and could do with a really good paint, but it's all there, and actually rock-wise it's in pretty good condition. If I was to come into your home and measure up, because I was going to be giving you a price to draft proof and overhaul it, what I would basically do is I would come in, look at the general condition of the window, and then I would take specific measurements of the width and the height of the staff bead, which is the internal beading holding the lower sash in, the parting bead, which is the middle beading which holds the upper sash in, and pretty much from that I can gauge everything that I require. Because what I would be doing, I would have a tube of perhaps 30 pieces of parting bead, again 30 pieces of staff bead, 100 metres of brush, 100 metres of sash cord. So basically what I would then do is I would make up a kit which had everything in it for that window, so that if I was to turn up on your doorstep, everything was there in a little bundle. I can get on with the window, and that saves me about an hour each time that I go to somebody's house. Okay, so here's a close-up of the actual window itself. So this here is the staff bead, and then in here is the parting bead, and up here along the top is the extra parting bead. I would say only probably less than 5% of the windows that I deal with have that, so it's very unusual, but as I've already said, it's worth considering. Now, another consideration when looking at these windows is just how long has it been since the window was touched or looked at. The majority of windows I go to, but this is an exception unfortunately, have the top sash completely sealed shut and painted shut. So one of the things that I would be dealing with when I actually attack the window would be to run a knife around the edges to free off the paint between the sash and the sides of the frame, and to gain perhaps the parting beads here. Again, you can see that they're loose on this one, but an awful lot of times it's actually completely painted shut from there down to there. So in order to release the parting bead from the frame or the lower sash from the parting bead, all of these joints, you need to run a Stanley knife down them. Okay, I've removed the staff bead from the sides and the top, and I have immediately, no surprises, I've immediately found a problem with the bottom. The staff bead on the bottom is all part and parcel of the sill. Until I actually cracked the paint and stuck a chisel in it to see what was going on, I wouldn't have known. So what I'm now going to have to do is I'm now going to have to cut this off, but get it flush so that I can put my new staff bead where this is. I'll pick up the camera in a minute and I'll just show you the problem. Okay, so this is all one piece of timber. So it was manufactured like that. Now my staff bead is going to replace this, so I have to cut this down to here, which is going to be a bit of a pickle because you can't get a planer on it and just plane the thing off. But what I can do is I can get a jigsaw to it and I can cut it roughly, and then I can sand it smooth with a small sander. If you attempt to chisel this off, the whole thing will just fall to pieces. It would be a nightmare. So no chisels on this one. Okay, so I've removed the problem at the bottom, and I've done it with a jigsaw and I've done it with a sander. I wouldn't expect anybody to have one of these unless they work with something like the window care repair system. It's a very specialist bit of kit. Jigsaw, easy enough to use. In actual fact, if you didn't have a jigsaw at the depth, what you could have done is you could have cut a couple of slots down into it in order to knock out a section with a hammer and chisel about 3 inches wide, I suppose, and use a little handsaw. Very carefully work your way along the crack between the staff bead section and this timber here, and then cleaning the top off afterwards. With machines, in real time, it's just taken me about 5 minutes. With hand tools, I don't know, you could be messing around with it for 20 minutes, half an hour I suppose. But that's that bit done. So with the staff bead off, the next thing we do is we take out the lower sash. So for cutting sash cords, I always use these. And basically bring the sash to the bottom if you can. This doesn't want to go anywhere really, it's very tight in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this cord here, and I'm going to risk what happens next. That's alright. And I'm going to leave that hanging. Okay. This one comes down. So I'm going to cut this one. I'll put a knot in it, because I don't want all of the weights to end up in the bottom of the pockets at the same time. So lower sashes out, find somewhere for that. The next thing to come out is the parting bead, which is this here. Now most of the time these are in tight. The reason why this is also loose and horrid is because this has been sat out in a builder's yard getting soaking wet and doing all kinds of stuff. What you would normally do is you take a Stanley knife and you would run it down the crack between the parting bead and the frame in order to crack and break the paint. If you don't do that, if you force this out, it can potentially pull big chunks of paint off, and you're trying to limit the amount of damage that you do. This side, alright, there. And you would do exactly the same on the outside. It's irrelevant here because they're all loose. But if you were to run a knife down the outside there, when you remove this bead, you're less likely to cause paint damage, so that's less time you need to do messing around with fixing the damage you've done. In order to remove parting beads, I use a chisel as a lever and I use a pair of pliers. If you go on and watch a lot of videos, and when I first started doing this 10 years ago, what you can do is you can quite simply belt and braces, grab a thin little chisel and a hammer, stuff it in the side of the parting bead, hit it really hard, and the parting bead will spring out. But again, it causes damage. You get a little chunk out of there where the chisel has inevitably gone into the side of the frame. If you grab the parting bead itself with a pair of pliers and then stick a chisel in, flat side against the pliers, curved side against the frame, and use it as a lever, you can actually pull the parting bead out without damaging the frame. So basically, if I do it on this side, yeah, probably just about see that, lever in and then I pull. Now here, at the meeting rail, it needs to be pulled slightly out because it can't clear. In fact, I'll take that off the tripod and show you. Okay, at the meeting rail here, the actual parting bead is tight in here. So if you try and pull the whole thing out without levering it away, it's going to go nowhere. So you've got to actually lever it off. Depending on how tight it is, if you've loosened it with pliers lower down, then you can get a chisel into this gap here, just move it sideways and get the whole thing to come out. Now this, because it's also wet, I can just do it with my hands. Okay, so I'm going to take the parting beads out. Which leaves us with the upper sash. Now, removing this, they're normally quite tight. Bring it down to the bottom, cut the cord, tie a knot in that, and lift the sash out. It can involve a bit of wiggling, sometimes it's get caught. There we go. Put that somewhere safe. Now a word of caution with top sashes. Top sashes tend to be painted shut. Why, I have no idea. Laziness, I think, basically. Somebody's done some painting, they've got stuck, they've not been freed off, and then there's 50 years of paint on top. So you don't actually know what's going on underneath. You don't know whether the cords are actually attached and whether there's any balance weights or anything until you're at a point where you're taking it out. If there's no cords, those things can drop like a stone. So just be careful, really. Now, upper parting bead. I'm going to give this a wiggle. Free up the paint. have there is a completely clean line where the knife has cut the paint. So in essence I could, I'm not going to, but I could pretty much leave that like that and not worry about it. But that's the first step. Second step now will be getting the weights out, wrinkle the pockets here, and then cleaning up the frame. So what I'm going to do, I am going to use a lever, again, a chisel, and I'm going to open the pockets, which are these pieces of timber in here. Now most of the time, they're held in with a sort of an overlap lap joint at the bottom and a triangular section that pushes in at the top. So if you lever at the top, it's a waste of time. All you're going to do is you're going to break timber and split stuff. If you leave it at the bottom, it should slide down. Now these, unfortunately, have a problem in that the tops have been screwed shut with screws that are, well, there's not much left of them. They're certainly not going to undo. So I'm going to lever it and I'm going to see what happens to the screw. And the screws come out. There we go. And the same on this side. Gently does it. There we go. Once these are out, I can then get to the weights. So one at a time. Undo your cord, put your hand here to get hold of the bottom of the lead weight. Drop the lead weight through. Pull it out. I would do the other one, but it's already missing. Same on this side. That's completely stuck. That's the one. So that's their weights out. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a scraper and I am going to go around and I'm going to scrape the sides of this. I'm going to remove any nails that have been left in the sides. I am going to scrape the inside face of the front of the sash, where the top sash rubs up and down there. The paint here isn't too thick, so I would be tempted to smooth it. So I'm going to go and clean this face, clean these up a bit, scrape this edge, do the same across the top, and whilst I'm doing that I'm going to switch you off. Okay, so using a scraper, in my case I tend to use one of these limbide scrapers, although I have also got one of these more detailed Hamilton scrapers, but this is sort of the weapon of choice. With the scraper, I have cleaned up the sides, I've cleaned up the inside of the front face where the top sash runs against that surface. I have cleaned up around the bottom where the parting bead is going to go, and I've also basically just gone around that groove where the parting bead goes with a 1/4 inch chisel you could do with a screwdriver, and just clean any muck and filth that's out of there, and then giving it a very good hoover. And at this point you have a decision to make depending on what you're planning on doing. You could prime it and undercoat it whilst everything is out of the way. Bear in mind that's going to be probably an hour's wait before you can do anything else. You can leave it in the raw. Certainly this section behind the upper sash and this section behind the lower sash would never have been painted anyway. You could leave those areas with the raw, and you could even scrape the outside where the lower sash comes down. You could scrape that back to bare timber. Originally, when these were made, the paint on the outside would have finished about here. The paint on the front face would have finished on this edge, and there would have been no paint up here at all. What we tend to find is over years, all of this gets covered in thick paint. But really it's your preference on how far you want to go. You must clear this surface. That's a given. You must do that, otherwise the top sash isn't going to run smoothly. But how far you go is up to you. And then at this point, do you paint or do you put the window back together? And depending on how long it's going to be before you paint, do you give the sides a good coat of wax? I tend to use either Bry wax, fantastic, really, really good stuff, or Libron Black Bison wax, again, very good stuff. And what I tend to do, once I know what's going on as far as painting, if it's been painted and that's it, it's then not going to be touched again for a year or 2 years, however long it takes the customer to paint the outside again. I will quite happily give everything a liberal coating of wax, not only on the frames but also on the sides of the sashes before they go back, and that just ensures that they run smoothly on here. But if there's any chance whatsoever that there's going to be some painting done in the foreseeable future, it should go without saying, but don't wax it, because you can't paint over wax. You're just creating future problems which you then got to try and get off with industrial wipes and so on and so forth. So consider that, but for the sake of argument on this one, I'm going to wax it because we're just playing with it anyway. Okay, I've given everything a coat of wax on the actual frame, so we're pretty much at the point where we want to put the weights back in with new sash cords. But before I do that, and whilst I can see everything, and before the cords are hanging out of the pulleys and in my way at the top, I am going to try the top sash back in the frame so that I can see whether it fits square, whether it needs planing, and so on. So I'll grab the sash. And at the moment, it's still got its cords in the side. These have been pinned in. So what I'm going to do is use a pair of pliers, and I'm going to roll sideways with the pliers and basically just pull the cords out. Sometimes it's as easy as that. Sometimes you've actually got to sacrifice a chisel or a screwdriver and attack from above in order to get the tacks out. So that's free of cords and back in the frame. So I know at the bottom I've got clearance either side, not much. What have I got in the top? So in the top I've got a bit of clearance either side, not much. It would actually be beneficial, I think, to take a millimetre off. It goes up tight across the top. Not that we'll see that once the parting bead is back in, but with most windows, of course, we would see that because that parting bead's not there. So it's okay across the top. So there's nothing to worry about there. So that, we can plane the side, we can machine the top for a brush, but as far as worrying about the weights and the cords, we've seen what we need to see, so that can come out of the way. Right. Now, sash cords, weights, etc. I use my long-gone grandmother's weighing scales to weigh the sashes and the weights to make sure that they actually match each other. If the weights aren't heavy enough, the sashes will drop. In a perfect world, the weights and the sashes will match each other. And if they don't, what I have is these lead weights, which I will add to the existing weights until they do match each other. The most important thing in all of this is one, weighing scales, and two, what we call a mouse. Now, I've not seen these in sash window kits, but this is basically a mouse. And what it is it's a little tiny piece of chain. In this case, it came out of a automatic closing hinge on a door, and it's attached to a piece of cotton brick line with a knot, and at the other end is a slip knot. Now, you cannot put cords in a sash window without this, or something that will do this job. You might get away with a screw that you push through fat end first with the pointy end attached to a piece of string. I actually haven't seen anybody that sells these, to be honest. I think anybody that gets into this trade makes their own, but you'll need it for the cord. The other thing is, you can do a very convoluted, very fancy threading of the cord backwards and forwards through all four. I'm not going to do all of that. I learnt it 10 years ago, and it was such a pain in the backside if you ever got it wrong that there was just no point. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to weigh the sashes, I'm going to weigh the weights, I'm going to see whether they're the same, and if not, I will calculate the lead, then I'll start cording and I'll show you exactly what's involved in that. Okay, I've weighed the sashes, I've weighed the weights, and surprise, surprise, each sash needs 4 pounds of lead adding to the weight in order to balance it out. Now, I'm fortunate, I have a bag of these weights, so that's not an issue. If you've got a kit, and obviously you haven't purchased any of this lead, what do? Well, in here I have bundles of bits and bobs I have collected out of windows over the years, like this. You could go to a builder's merchant's and purchase some lead and make this kind of stuff up. Okay? I personally would suggest you don't. And the reason is because sometimes I go somewhere, I deal with a window and this stuff is shoved up inside the frame somewhere and you can't get it out. It stops the weights from moving correctly. You end up having to cut very big holes in things to get all of this rubbish out. So personally I wouldn't. What I would do is I would put the top sash in. I'd do all the machining and everything that we've yet to do first. I would put the top sash in, and once it's up, I would put some screws under it either side to hold it in place. I would fit the parting bead, which we've yet to do, and I would fit it without nailing it in. I'd fit the lower sash and hold that in with screws, and I would wait for the lead to arrive. The £1 add weights are definitely the best way to deal with this. You can use your own stuff, but I really wouldn't do it. Right, I'm going to switch you off again and I'm going to start getting rid of the cords. Okay, I've got my sash cord, I've got my mouse, I've got my lead weights, I've got the original weights. The old sash cords I've levered out of the bottom of or out of the top rather of the weights with the chisel and thrown those away. So rather than do some fancy convoluted knot that goes through everything at once, I'm basically going to do them one at a time, and you can't go wrong. Basically, your mouse over the top of the pulley and gently drop it down inside. Keep the rope in the middle of the pulley. You don't want it to get stuck over the side of the pulley. Then you can reach inside, you can find a rope, you can pull your cord through. Now, sometimes you've got to be a bit persuasive, but that's through. Now, I'm already noticing that this pulley doesn't want to spin, so that's a separate issue I need to deal with in a minute. That one's okay, that one's okay, that one's okay, but this one is tight. Basically, it's rusted up. Once I'm through, I take the cord, I pass it through my weights. I'm adding £4 per sash, so that's £2 either side, so 1, 2, and then through the top of the weight, in this case, out of the side, and then a very simple granny knot is all you need. As long as the knot is bigger than the hole it's going to try and come back through. Give it about an inch approximately of extra cord at the end. What I do, I fold it over and I feed that extra cord in at the same time as I'm poking the knot into the hole. So nothing is coming out. And then that goes back inside the frame, like so, and we have one. Now, I'll do all four, I'll switch off again in a second, but basically, I cut these off halfway down. For me, I buy 100 metres at a time. I know that you can work out that actually you only need to cut it off here, but I've had 6 or 7 occasions in 10 years where I've cut it short because I've been trying to be clever, and then I've had to do it all again. So now, I'd rather waste a little bit of sash cord and make sure that I don't have to do it twice. And if you're buying it in a kit, you'll end up having more than enough anyway. So again, thread it through, halfway down, and cut it off. Okay, sash cords are in. In real time it's taken about 5 minutes. The one that was stuck, I've given it a tap with a hammer and it's now running. So all of them will actually go. Moving around where I want to be, so that's absolutely fine. Clear away the sash cord and the grandma's weighing scales and everything else, and we'll move on to how we machine the top sash. What I will say, okay, this is the upper sash, and I'm going to do 3 things to it. First thing I'm going to do, which actually I've done, is I'm going to clean the paint off of these areas. What you tend to get is massive build-up of paint on the edges on the front and on the back, on the sides. People tend to paint, the brush goes a bit short, so you get sort of a rough edge. You get it off with a scraper, which I've just done. Normally if I was doing it at somebody's house as opposed to doing this as an example, I'd run a belt sander down there because it actually takes it off cleaner. But for speed, I've just used my limb-bind scraper. So clean these off. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to plane 2mm off. I'm going to take 1 millimetre off of either side, because although it ran okay in the frame, with some paint on at the bottom, I could see that potentially there was going to be some issues. There was about 1.5 millimetres of clearance either side. So I'm just going to take that out another 1 millimetre either side. Then I'm going to router a slot into the top. When we're at that point, I'll switch on again and I'll show you what's going on with the router. Okay, so I have planed 1 millimetre off of either side of the top sash. I've scraped the paint that I want to remove from the front and rear faces so it should run smoothly in the frame. And I'm now at the point where I'm going to router a slot in the top to fit a draft proofing brush. Now, I have a router, in my case it attaches straight to my Henry, and in it I've got a 8mm cutter. Now, the draft fix pile carrier that I normally use, I believe is actually 7.5mm, or possibly it's even 7, I'm not sure. And that they actually provide a cutter that suits their carrier. The reason I'm using 8mm is because I have been using these for years and I've collected loads of them, so until I run out I'm not going to buy any more. In reality, when you look at it visually, a millimetre difference in the slot, you're not really going to see anything. So that's why I'm using this. What I will do when I've done the slot and I've cut it all and fitted it in, I'll pin it at each end as well. But anyway, let's switch on and here we go. Now, in a perfect world, you would be able to get your slot away from where the pulley comes down in here. I've seen probably 2 or 3 sashes in my time that have been so thick that there's been plenty of room. Most people will run their brush straight up the middle or just slightly to one side, which is what I've done here. Now, this slot will contain a pile carrier. This, and into this pile carrier I will fit a brush that looks like that, and then what I'll do is I will peel off the back of the self-adhesive, put it in, trim it to length and tack each end. Okay, so here is the brush in its carrier in the slot. Now what I do is self-adhesive, it's gone in a slot because I'm using a slightly fatter router cutter and you can't really tell. But what I also do is I pin it, and I pin it about there, just this side of this joint through here. And the reason I do that is because I want it to hold, but I don't want to pin it into here or into there. And the reason is, from experience, when you actually use the router at the start and the end of the cut, you tend to come up slightly and go down slightly. So what you get is a perfect slot through the middle here that's 4mm deep, and then just as it goes off the edge it goes down another millimetre or something. And if you put the pin in there, what tends to happen, it springs the brush up, so you end up putting pins in along here and along here and along here and so on and so forth, when frankly it probably would have been okay in the first place. The pins are just supposed to be extra, they're not supposed to cause any problems. So that's the brushing, and now I'll put this back on the tripod and I'll hang it. Okay, sash is going in, so what do I need? I need a drill, I need some screws or some nails. I prefer using screws. I need some cutters for the cord and the sash, and that's basically it. You offer the sash up, hold it in place, grab the sash cord right next to where it comes out of the pulley, because that needs to come down inside the sash here further than it does at the top here. If you can't get that right, you've got to lift the sash up and support it before you screw it on. Because what will happen is, if the attachment of the cord on the sash is too high, the sash won't close. It will be battling against the weights. So you grab it at the top of the pulley. You could normally measure it by eye, but basically it's that much. So as long as I've attached it from there down, I'm fine. Now what I would do is I screw it. Lots of people use pins, tacks, nails of all description, but I screw it because that means that if I ever have to take it to pieces, or the customer ever has to take it to pieces, what I can do, you can drive the screw through the cord up near the pulley, and then just unscrew these and leave it on. Now this particular cord is a waxed cotton cord, and it has a polyester cord through the middle of it, which means that within its design tolerance, it won't ever break. And it also means it won't stretch. Traditional cords made out of hemp and jute would have stretched, or would have needed pre-stretching. So it doesn't stretch, it doesn't break, it looks original, and best of all, it's made in the UK. So 1, 2, 3 screws, don't be stingy. And that polyester core also means that if you drive a screw through it, it doesn't pull out. Traditional ropes, which would have had a knot tied in the end, if you tried to pin those, you'd have to put an awful lot of pins in them because it would keep tearing through. But with this, you can just drive a screw through the side, 2 or 3 screws in there, then trim it to length, and forget about it. It's not going to break, it's not going to do anything. Job done. Right, so that's cords on. I'll do get these weights out of the way, and we'll see. There we go. Straight up to the top. We can hear the brush being squished. When it gets there. The gaps on the side are fine. The gaps at the top are really good. It sits pretty equidistantly all around. So that's top sash done. Next stage. Parting beads. Okay, parting beads. We have a parting bead to go across the top, so I measure the width of the window, I add about 1 centimetre to it, and that will be the piece that goes to the top. Once that's in, I'm going to measure from just underneath that to the meeting rail, to the middle of the meeting rail on this upper sash. Because what's going to happen, the parting bead from there is going to come down to this point, and it's going to have a brush that pushes against the upper sash. And then hidden behind the meeting rail where you can't see it, we will have a cut, and the parting bead that comes the rest of the way will have the brush on this side pressing against the outer side of the lower sash. Okay? That will be combined with other stuff which we'll do as we go. But basically I'm going to cut a piece of the top, and I'm going to measure under that down here with a tape measure, and I'm going to cut 2 for that. Then I'll explain in it. Okay, I've cut my parting bead for the top and for the sides up to the meeting rail. I've put brushes in. What I've done is I've left them slightly long where they're going to go to the top, and I've just nicked it with a Stanley knife in order to be able to bend it over like that. What I then do is put it in the slot, and I tap it home against the top of the window frame. Now you can see I've actually had to plane this slightly because this window has literally come in from being outside for a few years. It's swollen up. So in order to solve that, I've had to plane it to get it to fit. Normally you wouldn't have to worry about that, to be fair. You can buy these in 8mm and 7mm wide. 8mm fits most things, but this is down to the window. So what I now do with this remaining piece is hammer it in, and then I will get the camera and bring it over here so you can have a look. Okay, so here's the top. Now the parting bead from left to right went in first and was cut to the width of the frame plus about another 5mm so that you could just tuck it in either side. Then the parting beads that run down here were cut next. And basically I measured from up there down to this point in the meeting rail. And when we close this up, let me just move this a second. When we close this up, at this point here, there's going to be a joint, and at this point here, there's going to be a joint, which you won't see because the meeting rails of both sashes will cover it up. But what you will have is a potential issue that you have to cut there. Now, this side is okay, but basically the parting bead must be able to travel past this section here. Now this side is okay, mainly because there's an awful lot of play in the frame. This side needs cutting. If it's not cut off at this point here, so that it can pass by here safely, what will happen is the whole window will be pushed out of true as far as the sashes are concerned, and you'll have areas here where the draft proofing brush can't do its job. So that's my next thing. Basically, I'm going to shoot the sash up and down a few times, and then I'm going to trim that off. Okay, so I've trimmed that now so that it should pass by. I've moved the sash up and down several times, and I know that this side still has just about enough clearance. If it turns out when I'm moving it up and down later that it hasn't, then I'll adjust it, but for the moment it's okay. Now at the top, I've left little tabs of the brush. Now until I've actually got the bottom in, I'm going to leave those up there. Those will be trimmed off, but because I have bent it over and put it in there and then tapped it up, what that's doing is that's locking the brush in. If the brush was trimmed off flush, what could potentially happen is if the parting bead moves sideways, the brush could start moving up and down. And whenever you move the sash up and down, the brush could be sliding up and down. And I've seen it happen. Normally what happens is there's a mismatch at this point. So every time you pull the sash down, the brush that you can see in that gap there gets slid down, and eventually it just comes out. Right. Okay. The lower parting bead, it goes from here to the sill. In order to measure that, I've already got the brush in. I'm going to put the base here that hasn't got any brush near it. I don't want it folded over. I'm going to place that against the bottom of the slot where it will fit against the sill, and I'm going to look across to the joint, and I'm going to mark it, and then I'm going to cut it. But before I cut it, I'm going to pull the brush through so that I've got some spare at the bottom. I'm going to do that both sides, and then I'm going to try them to see if they fit. Now basically, when it's cut, I want it so that I can push it in the top and just slide it in with the brush bent underneath, but tight. I don't want it so that it's loose and moving up and down, which means I'm going to be trying several times perhaps to get it right. Okay, so the lower parting bead is in. You can see its little tail there. It's in tight. At the moment, there's a slight mismatch up here. What I will do in a moment, I will pin these so they'll be in line. But should they ever move across, you can then see the potential issue with this brush being able to perhaps slide out if it wasn't held by having these tabs at the bottom. So that fold done, this one's exactly the same. So it's nice and tight at the joint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pin these in position at the top, in the middle, and towards the joint of the upper parting bead, and a couple high up and a couple low down on the lower parting bead. And what that will do is it will hold it in place if the wood dries out and shrinks. They're suddenly not going to fall out. What I prefer to use is a stainless steel pin that's 40mm long, and it's, I believe, 1.6mm across. And what I do is I pre-drill with a 2mm drill bit the actual parting bead. I don't drill all the way through it, but I drill in it until it's past the brush, and I'll show you that, and I'll show you why in a moment. Okay, that is a piece of parting bead. It's 8mm wide. It has a C channel in it, which the brush goes through. Having gone to the effort of cutting them all to length, the last thing you really want to do is for it to split. So my recommendation, what I always do, is I pre-drill the holes where the pin's going to go. If I drill it through into the bottom bit here and then stop, when I put the pin in, it's not going to split the parting bead, but as it comes out the bottom, it will expand the timber. So what it will then do is it will expand the timber sideways into the channel that it's sitting in, and it will grip sideways. It's not just the pin coming through the bottom that's holding it by nailing into good timber. It's actually expanding it sideways as well. So that's why I do it. I have seen people do it with nail guns and God knows what. And what tends to happen is it splits, and then there's a lot of swearing, a lot of shouting, and you end up redoing it. So experience has told me, always pre-drill it. Then you've got a good job. Pins, you can use normal galvanised pins, you can use zinc coated, you can use whatever you like really. Stainless steel is what I prefer to use. It doesn't cost that much more, and you never get that unsightly look of a rust just coming out of a tiny pin on what is otherwise nice white timber. There's just little rust dots around. So stainless steel, if you can get hold of it. The lower sash is now ready to go. What I've had to do in order to make it fit is I've planed a couple of millimetres off of each side. I've also had to trim the front face of the sashes at this point here, and the same at the other end, in there, where it goes up against the parting beads. If I hadn't done that, it wouldn't close up. It would actually press against this, and you then have a big gap down the middle here. What I've also done, just to get it absolutely perfect, is I've planed the bottom and I've taken off 2mm. That's to get it absolutely perfect through here. Now, top tip when you're doing that, if you're using an electric planer, electric planers spin at some ridiculous speed, and if you plane from one side all the way across and out the other, it will split all of this end grain across. So what I do, I set my planer to 1mm, and I plane from one side, pushing against that grain so it's held together, just past halfway, and another pass about a third of the way. Then I spin it round and I start at this end, and I go all the way across till I join, and then all the way across until I join. Then I will set the gauge to 0, and I will just take a pass across the middle there. What you get is a pretty good finish without messing up the ends of the sash. So this now fits, and what I'll do in a moment, I will what I'll do is I'll grab the camera and I'll show you what it looks like at the bottom. Okay, this is the bottom on the other side, where the bottom rail meets the sill, and you can see that's pretty tight. It's pretty good. And bearing in mind there's going to be a brush in there anyway, that's fine. Meeting rail, we'll go around and have a look at the top. The meeting rail there is flush, and there it's not quite flush, but that's actually because the hinge, sorry, the lock needs adjusted. If I push it all the way up, it's pretty good. Bottom sash, I've already machined and fitted a brush into the bottom in exactly the same way that I did in the top of the top sash. Basically, the router with the right bit and a guide, and passed it straight past. For the meeting rail, there's a problem. Well, there's three. There's the horns here, and there's the lock in the way. So you've either got a guide then you're running the guide in between, and then you're having to try and scribe lines and then do it freehand, or you take the guide off of the router and you put a straight edge on here with some clamps in place. Now, in order to do that, what you basically need to know is that on the bottom of here, this is the piece that will actually run up against the straight edge. You need to know in relation to that edge where your router cutter sits. So I know that this router cutter sits approximately 46 to 55, somewhere around that, 46 to 55 millimetres away from that edge. So what I then do is I work out where on this meeting rail I want that brush to go, and I want it to go in the lower part. So I'm going to measure down. I know where my router cutter is, and I'm going to measure down, and I put a line here 55 millimetres away from the top edge of that section. And if I've got it right, my cutter will go straight down the middle there. So I put a line on each end, and what I do is I take a straight edge, which in this case I'm using an old spirit level, which is now defunct, it's of no use for its original purpose. A couple of drip clamps, and drip clamps. What I can then do, I can run a couple of passes with the router. The first pass, I'm not going to try and go all the way in. What I'm going to do is I just want to go in about a millimetre, so that it digs in. But actually, this surface at the moment is too rough. So, scrape up. To run my router on. You start with the router on it, releasing it, pressing it back down until it touches the paint that's there, and lock it up. Then I can pull out my depth gauge, a couple of millimetres, so I know that if I release it and press it down, I've then got an extra couple of millimetres, so that should now cut a couple of millimetres into that paint. So, put everything on. So, I gave it a slight pass, and I adjusted it down, and I did it again. Now the awful zoinging noise was basically the router cutter hitting the screws for this bracket. Sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you're not. If they're old screws, they're brass, it sounds awful, but actually it's the screw that takes the damage, not the router cutter. Now the reason for doing a very slight pass first was because if you did a deep pass, even with good clamps and this, which is pretty substantial, it's pretty solid, it will still try and push away. You'll still end up with a line that's not actually straight, and what you'll end up with a couple of passes, you'll end up with the first pass where you thought it was, and the second one slightly wider. So a little tiny pass first, and then go down to your depth of about 4mm, and that's it. Basically that just needs the fitting of the brush, which I'll do in a moment, and we'll try it in the window. Bottom sash is now in. I've fitted my brush in here, I've trimmed it to the length, I've got a couple of panel pins in, approximately this distance from the ends, just to hold it, just in case the adhesive stuff ever fails. The brush is in the bottom here as well, and exactly the same, but being in the bottom, I've never had an issue with it, but it seems sensible. I put a pin in the middle here, and a couple of pins towards the ends. That way, it's just making sure, really. That's in. It moves. What I'll do in a moment is I'll take the camera out and have a look at the different brushes and where they all are before I put the staff bead in, and then we'll talk about doing that. Now this is looking from the outside, and you can see at the top the parting bead with its brush that runs all the way down to where they'll meet. This is the meeting rail of the lower sash, which forms the seal when the two sashes are closed, and this is the top of the top sash. So when that's closed, up there you know that you've got a brush right in the top and you've got a parting bead all the way around. This, the centre, the meeting rail of the lower sash, when that comes down, will seal the gap in here, and then under here you have another brush that's running along the bottom rail, and again you have the parting bead with its brush going the other way, which is sealing against this outside face. Once the staff bead is in anyway, that will basically just squeeze up to there, so the whole lot will be sealed. Staff bead. What I've got here, I have pre-cut my 4 pieces of staff bead, but I've cut them slightly long. Now, I use a chop saw. I use actually the smallest, lightest 110 volt chop saw I could find, which is this, and it's great. I've got massive chop saws and stuff, but I'm getting to the point where carrying stuff around for the hell of it seems pointless. And that's all I need. So I've cut these, I've put a mitre on one end, and I've cut them slightly long. Now some people are so sure of themselves that they will measure this with a tape measure, and they will go to the machine somewhere else and they'll cut a mitre, and they'll measure all the way to the other end, and they'll mark it with a pencil line, and they'll cut the mitre the other way, and then they'll turn up here and they'll try it, and it'll be 3mm short. So what I do, actually I pre-do this before I go to somebody's home. When I cut these to length as a kit, I put the mitre on one end and I leave it a couple of centimetres long, just in case I've messed up when I'm measuring. So what I can then do, I can offer it up, I can put the beveled edge into the frame, I hold this against the other end, and I reach in and I mark the back of it with a pencil. And I do that for all of them. Then I can go to my chop saw and I can cut the lot. And I know that the degree of accuracy that I'm using is better than if I relied on taking it away and doing it all in one go. Now, the sides, there's no harm in leaving these a millimetre long. Certainly what you want to do is remember to cut up to the black line that you've just left with your pencil and not over the black line that you've just left with your pencil. If you cut over it, you're going to be short. If you cut up to it, or slightly long, you'll be fine. In actual fact, if you cut slightly long and end up doing it twice to get it right, that's preferable. So I'm going to cut these, and I'll put some brushes in them, and then we'll have a look. Okay, I've cut my staff beads, and to prove the point, on the short ones, I've cut up to the black mark, and on the long ones, I've cut a couple of mils short of the black mark. And I've tried it, and they fit. So the next thing I have to do is to stop the brushes for the side pieces from going up and down. If everything is fitted correctly and the joints are closed up, which they will be in the corners, they shouldn't really slide out. But I have seen it occur, so rather than risk anything happening, I use one of these, which is a tap-wise stapler, and it staples tiny 10mm long brads. And I staple one of these into each, and then I'm tapping it home with a hand. I don't need to worry about the staff beads on the bottom. It's just the side. It's that. Then I can basically offer it all up and get into the right spot. So there's the base. Let's trim that off. In there, and we've got the left, which goes on here. Okay, topping. Not least, this side. Because they're slightly long, I'm having to spring them inside, so I'm pulling the bead outwards, pressed in the bottom first, and then sliding into it. If you're closer to the ground, it's actually easier to do it that way around and go for the top. So there is a little bit of bagginess here, but that will all close up and be nailed shut. So let's start. Press. Yeah, these are the most important points. You kind of work out for the meeting line because everything is bound up and tight there. So I start by pressing the bead so that I know that the sash is pressing up hard against the parting bead there. I can see it, but I don't want to completely crush the brush that's between the staff bead and the lower sash. I want it to be deformed, but I don't want it to be crushed. So I'm going to put that there. And I'm going to do the same at this end. I'd normally be doing this with a nail gun, to be honest. I tend to do is take the sash straight up, see what's going up there, and immediately it's getting tight on this side. So I'm going to use my hammer, and I'm going to use it as a lever to just pull that out. Okay. So that's pretty equidistant that way. then have to do is basically work my way around the bottom, which is actually more important than the top. And make sure that the brush is compressed. I can see that it's deformed, but not to the point where it's actually causing me problems with movement. That is basically it. It's yeah, pretty much the ugliest sash window I've ever left draft proof, but the brush is all the way around here, the brush is in the bottom here, the brush is in the sides there, the brush is there, this is all filled, so that's it. Okay, so this is the bottom where the staff bead here is meeting up against the bottom rail, and that is completely filled with a brush. You've got to look hard in there to see it, but basically there's a brush that's running all the way along and all the way up through that gap. So that's sealing that right up to that point there. Okay, then we have the continuance, which is the parting bead that goes all the way around the top, and then all the way along here is sealed with a brush as well, which I don't think you can even see from up here. On the outside, what are you actually going to see? You'll see the bottom of the sash. You're not going to see any brush in there at all. You can't see it, it's all closed tight. You'll see a slight brush that's visual. You can see it between the parting bead and the lower sash down there, and that's it. You cannot see really what's going on up there. So the parting bead and the brush in it from outside is all you're really going to see. If you were to look through the window, you'll just see the brush on the inside of the staff bead. But that's pretty much it. As far as draft proofing a sash window, that is what you have to do.